about the subject, despite the fact that I am a Muslim scientist and I was born and raised in a Muslim majority country and care about these things. So why did I know so little about this? I realized that I was not alone. I was not the only one who did not know. By and large, these contributions from the Islamic civilization have been ignored and forgotten, not only in the West, but in the Muslim world as well. So you will learn some of the reasons behind this from the presentations tonight, especially from the first one. On the other hand, sometimes we also see another extreme and exaggerations among some Muslims who somehow have the idea that Muslims invented everything, every scientific fact and discovery, and the West just stole it. There is also a lot of misinformation and myths, like fake news. A, one of the most popular such incorrect information is Muslims invented zero. You may have heard this one, many of you possibly. But at the same time, correct information, correct contributions by Muslim scholars are generally not known. Um, as the religion of Islam demands, we should be after the plain truth, no matter where it comes from. Our main purpose in this work is to find out the facts based on best available evidence and communicate it to the public. Our purpose here is not to glorify the Islamic civilization, but to tell a more accurate story and help spread accurate information. I see that a major reason for the lack of awareness on the subject is that it is not being taught in schools for the most part. Whereas school kids learn all about Renaissance scientists such as Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, as well as ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle, Euclid, and Archimedes, they almost never hear anything about equally important scholars in the history of science from the Islamic world, such as al-Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, Ibn Sina, Omar Khayyam, Ibn Khaldun, al-Biruni, al-Tusi, or al-Kashi, to name just a few. Neither did they learn anything about the influence of Islamic scholars on Renaissance scientists. This is despite the fact that modern researchers discovered these connections decades ago now. Based on research on primary sources, we have learned so much since the middle of the 20th century. Unfortunately, accurate information from academic research did not become common knowledge, and for the most part, it did not become part of the school curriculum. It is time to change this, and the Muslim community needs to do its homework on this. The first step is, of course, to educate ourselves. So we hope that tonight's event will be an inspiration for all of us. So tonight, we are going to have 3 talks and 2 digital stories, which are short documentary style movies. The first talk will give you a general overview and describe 2 narratives about the history of science. One widespread but not so accurate, at least in regards to Islamic science, and the other one is not so much known. Subsequent presentations will give us a sample of contributions to mathematics, sciences, and arts from the medieval Islamic civilization. We are grateful to be able to have this event this year despite the pandemic. So we hope that you'll find these presentations informative and inspiring. Before I turn over to students, I would like to make a couple of points. And for that, I will share my screen and show you a website. So I hope you can see my screen now. So this is a website at Kenyon College, which describes a project related to this topic, a summer project, which includes similar materials, digital materials that are similar to what you are going to see tonight. So here are a few links here, and more links, more digital materials. So those of you are interested in looking into this material in more details, this is available. And again, so here are the URL addresses of those pages. And I also invite any questions, comments, or ideas for collaboration or future work after this event. So I would like to give you my contact information as well. So please feel free to contact me, anything regarding, related to this matter. So, okay, so I would like to start sharing. Okay, I lost my Zoom control. Oh, did I not share? Oh, sorry about this. Okay, I realized that maybe I did not share what I meant to share. So this is the web page I I would like to share with you if you are interested in more materials related to this topic. And also, so here are the URL addresses and my contact information again. All right. Okay. So now I would like to turn to my students to present uh, their topics. So the first one will give us an overview of the two common narratives of history of science. Um, so, so Haley and Danny, can you please introduce yourself and start sharing your presentation?
I hate to bother you, but you still didn't share the addresses with the live stream.
So the address was put into the chat for everybody for the live stream. It is noodohio.org/live for anybody that needs the live stream address. NOOROHIO.org/live.
All right. Are we ready to introduce ourselves?
Yep.
All right. My name is Dennis Rothwell. I am a sophomore at Kenyon College, and I am majoring in film and Chinese.
I'm Haley Nero. I'm a freshman in college, and I'm majoring in English. This presentation is on constructing a narrative of the history of science. There exist two ways to perceive the history of science as it relates to Islam. The classical narrative, which is the one that has predominated our education throughout the world, and the alternative narrative, which is a more recent development. Now, this classical narrative is basically very Eurocentric. It came from the traditional interpretations of European scientists projecting their own views. First off, the classical narrative states that all science comes from Europe. As you can see with Galen, Archimedes, and Euclid, the classical narrative believes that science began with the Greeks and Romans. These Greeks and Romans, like Euclid, Archimedes, and Galen, along with Hippocrates, all were contributed to science. For example, Archimedes and Euclid contributed math, specifically geometry. Galen and Hippocrates contributed to medicine. Now, this was one of the main where science began, which was when classical era was often viewed as the cradle of Europe. There's a belief that no science came from the Middle East, and by extension, since no science came from the Middle East, no science came from the world. During the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome, there was a Dark Ages, which is when science basically stopped and Christianity came into power, which discouraged scientific learning. And meanwhile, in the Middle East, the classical narrative states, there was only a translation of European texts. These European texts were philosophers such as Aristotle and Galen. This meant that the Middle East served like the narrative states, as basically a refrigerator to keep the European text for Europe to discover once more. There was scientific stagnation not only in the Europe but also in the Middle East. According to this classical narrative, there was very little scientific discovery in the Middle East. And what little scientific discovery there was stopped by al-Ghazali, who wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which attacked the point of philosophy and science from a religious perspective and basically this religious fundamentalism put an end to what little science was performed. Then when the Renaissance started, it was all solely from the classical era, and Europe was not influenced by any other modern era, just basically the Greek and Roman works the Islamic era had preserved. Now, this classical narrative began from European ethnocentrists. These ethnocentrists believe that European culture, including science, is much superior to the culture of other science societies. This causes a vicious cycle. The cycle begins with them saying, my people are better, so I don't have to bother learning about other civilizations. I have never heard of other civilizations making scientific progress, so it must not have happened. I know that other civilizations never made scientific progress, so there's no point in researching the scientific tradition of other studies. And since there's no research indicating that other societies have made scientific progress, I know my society is superior.
So what Haley has just described is the predominant and pervasive story of how science and mathematics developed over the past 1,000 years. But in recent years, scholars and historians have proposed an alternative narrative, which we're going to look at shortly. Now, I suppose that everybody here already knows the five pillars of Islam, but it might be a bit of a surprise to some that there is a mathematical and scientific relationship between all of them. First of all, the creed, which is, of course, the belief that Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is his prophet, lends itself to the creation of many different branches of Islam, something which the logical and theological practice of Kalam addresses, and which we will discuss later. A mathematician named al-Haytham looked into using logic to determine which of the branches was which one was the most correct. Both fasting and prayer demand an accurate means of telling the time, which took into account astronomy and a mathematical means of determining the time of the day using the position of the sun. When it comes to pilgrimage, there is the Qibla problem, which comes into account for Muslims every single day because it uses some advanced mathematics. It's called spherical trigonometry, which is particularly unusual. And it, through a complicated trigonometric equation, it allows Muslims standing anywhere on earth to know exactly where Mecca is, allowing them to pray towards Mecca. And then finally, zakat, which is, of course, the giving of alms or taxation, is sometimes makes it necessary to use somewhat advanced fractional equations, such as knowing how to divvy up money among the members of an estate when the holder of the estate dies. But the relationship between Islam and science is much deeper than just the five pillars. In fact, there are three ways that we can look at the relationship, which we're going to explore now. The first one is that there's a philosophical and theological tradition that pervades Islam, which lends itself to mathematics. You're not likely to find in the Bible many passages which suggest that scientific discovery is necessary. However, what you're looking at right now is just one of many passages in the Quran that all essentially say it is necessary for men to determine the truth through observation and experimentation. It is a core tenet of Islamic philosophy that Muslims should study science. But there's a practical angle to it as well. Islam had some concerns it had to address that other world religions didn't. For example, the inheritance law in prayer times, which we discussed earlier, used mathematics and astronomy. The geometry of constructing mosques is often complicated and demanded some very specific geometric mathematical knowledge, which is something that another group will discuss further down the line. I've already discussed Kalam a little bit. Kalam is a very complicated logical branch of science, which lends itself to cosmological arguments, such as trying to prove definitively that a God exists, or that specifically the Islamic God is the one God. And it's probably one of the greatest, or one of the biggest disciplines of science that is specific to Islam. Astronomy is one of the oldest sciences, and it's very popular during the golden age of Islam. And it was necessary to help develop the lunar calendar. And the Muslim al-Mamun, the Caliph al-Mamun created the Baghdad House of Wisdom, which is not like an issue that Muslims had to address. Rather, it was a facet of Islamic society, which was specific to that religion. No other group had a place for philosophers, scientists, and polymaths to meet and discuss ideas under one roof. And you'll learn more about this later on tonight. But perhaps above all that is the fact that there wasn't just a philosophical basis or a practical basis for scientific discovery, but that it actually did happen. We can point to specific people who are perhaps some of the most important scientists and mathematicians of all time, and they all lived in Islamic society. We'll go on to the next one now. We're only scratching the surface of all the Muslim scientists that are necessary to discuss. Some of them we'll learn a little bit more later tonight. Perhaps one of the most well-known is al-Haytham, because lots of scholars have written about him specifically as proof that the classical narrative is invalid. He might be, truthfully, the most important scientist of all time because he was the first one to describe in words how science is performed. Now, other people had, of course, been scientists before him, particularly in Greece and India, but the process through which they performed science was not ever articulated. He developed the scientific method, which you can see on the right side of your screen, which explains exactly how to perform science. And without it, it would be impossible to formulate a valid conclusion from information. Experimentation depends on the scientific method to be reliable. In addition to this, he was probably one of the first people to understand how the human eye worked. He worked in the field of optics, which is based on how light and vision communicate. And he invented the camera obscura, a device that allowed people to project images from very far away. Now, al-Haytham might be the most important scientist, but there's also a case to be made that al-Khwarizmi is perhaps the most important mathematician because he made two extremely relevant additions to the field of math as a whole, to the extent that the concept of an algorithm upon which almost all mathematics is based is derived from his name. Firstly, he invented algebra, which is the foundation for almost all math other than arithmetic. It is impossible to do high levels of math without algebra. You cannot do calculus without algebra. You can't do trigonometry without algebra. You can't do more advanced mathematics like topology without algebra. And without the ability to do any of those things, the world would be radically different today. Without al-Khwarizmi, it wouldn't have been possible to send a man to the moon. It wouldn't have been possible to develop like national currencies that we have. Algebra is just so fundamental to the way that our society functions that it's almost impossible to say that al-Khwarizmi isn't the most important mathematician. And that would be even ignoring what might be the second most important development of all of mathematics, which is al-Khwarizmi bringing the Hindu numeral system, which is the one we use now, where each number from 0 to 9 is a digit, to Islam, which radically streamlined mathematics. I don't feel I have to explain that a base 10 system is more comprehensive than a base 60 system. Obviously, it's what we all use today, and it is the very basis for how numbers operate. And another one is al-Kashi, who might be the most important astronomer in a time when astronomy was probably the most important scientist. He was a mathematician who worked with arithmetic. He worked with geometry. He developed a very clever way to calculate pi and did so to 16 places. He developed the law of cosines, without which a lot of trigonometry would be impossible. And of course, his work as an astronomer paved the way for later astronomers, particularly in Europe, to make the discoveries that they did.
Now there's the question, which narrative is more accurate? The classical narrative or the alternative narrative? And this begs the question, how do we know which is accurate, since all this happened a long time ago, and who knows it's hard to determine which interpretation is right at first glance. Well, the classical narrative is based on stories, projections by European scientists, assumptions, basically ideologies. It's basically beliefs, while the alternative narrative is based on fact. We know that, for example, al-Haytham developed the scientific method. We know that al-Khwarizmi brought the Hindu numeral system to the Islamic world. We know all this from attested facts from these Islamic empires. Now, despite knowing all of these, that the alternative narrative is real, because of the prevalence of the classical narrative, there have been plenty of misattributions. For example, the decimal point. The decimal point was originally invented in the Arabic world less than 1,000 years before Simon Stebbin, who is often credited with the decimal point. It's so pervasive, this idea that Simon Stebbin invented the decimal point, that even a Nobel Prize winner in an introduction to a book about Simon Stebbin credits Stebbin with inventing the decimal point. There's Snell's law, which is actually named for, which was not invented by Snell despite being named after him. The scientific method, which, despite, as we said, that al-Haytham invented the scientific method, many people have been credited, usually people from Europe, like Roger Bacon, Galileo, Newton, pretty much everyone except al-Haytham, and pulmonary blood circulation, which was actually discovered in the Islamic world and was credited to someone else in Europe. There's also the Copernican Connection, when Copernicus did his book on proving heliocentrism, there were it turns out he used something called the 2C model, which you can see right here, which he did to show how everything rotated. And this 2C model was it's so obvious that this 2C model was copied from 2C that you could see that the letters that used the phonetic equivalents, like L for A, was basically used for Copernicus, and the only contradiction, F and Z, could be easily attributed to a mistake. And also, Ibn al-Shatir provided necessary proofs for Copernicus. Shatir had this specific theorem, which, according to research, this theorem would have been necessary for Copernicus since the works of Euclid and Archimedes couldn't have provided all the proof for Copernicus to come to this conclusion. So we know that Shatir's theorem really gave Copernicus the proof he needed. Unfortunately, there's the idea of to the winner goes the spoils, or basically because Europe won eventually went over Islam due to imperialism. Basically, that now Europe is not only advanced in politics, so they believe, but also in science, culture, and that this inferiority of science and culture isn't just because of laziness, but arguably is because of a way to show that these people are always inferior, so we should conquer them. It's not like they ever have anything to contribute, because if they did, it makes you wonder why are we conquering these people, you know? But however, that's changed. As you can see here, there's George Salaba's work, Islamic Science, which is a tome that we studied in our class that basically explains the contributions to astronomy Islamic scientists made and how these Islamic conclusions were basically influenced the European Renaissance. And there's also Stephen's novel, The Prisoner of al-Haytham, which is a biographical novel about al-Haytham and goes into detail about al-Haytham's work and discoveries with optics and how he possibly developed it in a prison.
Okay, so thank you, Haley and Danny. So again, we are going to address questions at the end. So we'll move on to the second presentation now, which is about House of Wisdom, which was an institution of research in early Islamic civilization. So our next group will talk about this institution and its impact in history of science. Okay, Alex, go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Alex Prosek. I'm a senior international studies and Spanish double major.
Hi, I'm Amanda Bradley. I'm an English and creative writing major, and I'm a junior.
Hi, I'm Talisha. I'm a sophomore American Studies major.
And today we're going to be talking to you about the House of Wisdom. So what is the House of Wisdom? So the House of Wisdom, or as it's known in Arabic, Bait al-Hikmah, was a library founded in Baghdad which housed over 1 million books. It was founded during the Abbasid Dynasty by Caliph al-Mansur in the second half of the 8th century. And it was known for hosting intellectuals, and it gathered academic sources from all over the world. This library was a product of the high levels of translation and academic thought of this period. So when we look at what the House of Wisdom actually looked like, it had specific rooms dedicated to scholars for reading, writing, bookmaking, and more, and a large open corridor in which lectures were held. It also had classrooms called munazaras and a personal library for the Caliphs. It also contained dorms for guests and students who would travel from far to come learn or teach at the library. It contained a mosque for daily prayers, and it had the creation of a great observatory. And this observatory, which is known as the Al-Shamsiyya Observatory, was known to contain the most advanced maps, astronomical tables, sundials, astrolabes, and a great protractor. And many great astronomers were known to have worked here, including Sind ibn Ali and al-Fargnani, whose calculation of the diameter of the Earth was used by Copernicus and Christopher Columbus later.
Okay, so in our last presentation, the last presentation talked a little bit about the alternative narrative versus the classical narrative. And I'm going to talk to you about the Caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty and the trajectory of how the House of Wisdom was inspired. But before I get into this, I would first like to let you know that I'm going to be talking about the translation movement, and the translation movement actually started much earlier than what a lot of scholars that subscribe to the classical narrative might believe. So the alternative narrative is that the translation movement started much earlier. Okay, so Caliph al-Mansur reigned from 754 to 775, and he was the second caliph of the Abbasid dynasty and the great-grandson of Caliph Abbas. He loved collecting books, and he was instrumental in translating works and instrumental in the translation movement, which only proceeded to grow through him. He was a lover of alchemy, and he fought for physicians and translators, and he also loved science. But he also had many enemies. So one story claims that he had to flee to Iraq, and once he fled to Iraq, he established the Abbasid Caliphate there, which started the golden age of science. So, and he also created scientific centers in and near mosques. So Caliph al-Mahdi reigned after the death of al-Mansur, and he collected manuscripts during war expeditions, and during his reign a paper was introduced in China and thereafter in the Arab world. So Caliph al-Rashid, and we don't know how long Caliph al-Mahdi reigned for. Caliph al-Rashid reigned from 786 to 809. Under him, the first paper mill was established in 795, and Baghdad acquired more wealth under him, and he's actually very closely linked to Charlemagne, with whom he exchanged many texts and political peace offerings. He was actually sent an elephant by Charlemagne one time. And he basically, like the caliphs who followed him, he wanted to do everything in his power to expand the collection of his library, and he transported books from all of the lands he conquered to Baghdad. More fun facts are he's referenced in 1001 Nights, which I'm going to talk about later, and he paid very large salaries to intellectuals, and he oversaw the creation of a paper mill in Baghdad. So Caliph al-Mamun reigned 813 to 833 AD. He is probably the most famous caliph member of the House of Wisdom, and it's under his reign that the House of Wisdom truly began to take shape. He was an avid learner, and he was the one to really bring some of the most famous scholars, which I'm going to talk about later, to the House of Wisdom. He's the one who contributed the astronomical observatory that we talked about earlier, which is the Shamsiyya Observatory, which is again equipped with astronomical tables, sundials, and astrolabes and protractors. He was also the head of a scholarly expedition where he gathered together some of the greatest scholars to measure the Earth's circumference. And he would also send scholars on expeditions to retrieve books. And one of my favorite expeditions that he sent these scholars on was he desperately wanted to collect texts from the Sicily Library, which was beyond the House of Wisdom, one of the most famous libraries in the world at that time. And so he convinced the king of Sicily that he no longer needed these the texts within the library, and so he basically took them for himself, and he took 100 camels from Khorasan to Baghdad with these hundreds of books that he'd collected from this king who was fooled by this incident. So scholars and works. So one of the most famous scholars was al-Khwarizmi, who was a cartographer, astronomer, and geographer who wrote the Book of Addition and Subtraction according to Hindu calculation. He was also the father of the decimal point, which was his personal invention. And the decimal point was very revolutionary, as it also served as the beginning of the algebraic calculation. He also authored a book called The Map of the World, which is where he calculated the circumference of the Earth accurately, which was likely also referenced when I was discussing measuring the circumference of the Earth earlier. So Hunayn bin Ishaq was was probably the most prominent translator in the House of Wisdom, and he specialized in translating Hippocrates' works. Interesting fun fact is al-Mamun, for every book that he translated, al-Mamun paid bin Ishaq its weight in gold. And he also really enjoyed translating books with large letters and having large paper to translate those on. Ibn al-Haytham was a mathematician and translator and scientist who wrote the Book of Optics, which identified light reflecting off objects and how it enters the eye. And this also contributed to the modern scientific method. We don't really know if he actually wrote the Book of Optics while he was at the House of Wisdom, but we can assume that the Book of Optics was a very important text that within that time. So there are definitely connections to the House of Wisdom, and he would also speak a lot to other budding scholars there. So 1001 Nights, which you may have heard of, it's also called Alf Layla wa Layla, and it's probably the most famous text from the House of Wisdom. It's basically a collection of fairy tales from Baghdad in India, and some of the most famous stories you might have heard of are the story of Aladdin and the wonderful lamp, about the boy who finds the lamp and rubs it, and then a genie appears to grant him 3 wishes, and the story of Scheherazade, which is the framework story. So Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Euclid, Aristophanes, these are more of the scholars who contributed to the House of Wisdom, and their works were translated by many. Finally, sorry, I just wanted to add that Al-Kindi, who was briefly discussed earlier, he was a cryptographer and a music theorist and one of the great pioneers of mathematical science.
So, a mathematician who had strong ties to the House of Wisdom was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He was not only a mathematician, but an astronomer and geographer, working under the patronage of Caliph al-Mamun. In arithmetic, he is most known for introducing the Hindu numeric system through translation. These are the numerals that we use today. He is also most notably known as the father of algebra, since he was the first to present a systemic and general way to solve linear and quadratic equations. This can be seen in his book Kitab al-Jabr wal Muqabala. In geography, he conducted a project on determining the circumference of the Earth, and in astronomy, he worked in the observatory that was located in the House of Wisdom. So al-Khwarizmi's legacy to Islamic society included a way of representing numbers that led to easy methods of computing, even with fractions, a science of algebra that could help settle problems of inheritance, and a map that showed the distribution of cities, seas, and islands on the Earth's surface. Algebra really solidifies al-Khwarizmi's legacy. His method for finding the unknown makes it possible for solving problems of inheritance, because with algebra, the unknown does not apply to one specific problem. Scholars after al-Khwarizmi, such as Thabit B. Qura, Abu Kamil, Abu Wafa, al-Khwarizmi, al-Kindi, al-Samawala, Omar Khayyam, and al-Kashi were able to come along and further develop algebra thanks to al-Khwarizmi's scholarship. So even though al-Khwarizmi did algebra in a different way than we do it today, his algebra was completely in prose, whereas we use symbols. His use of algebra is still influential and helps explain why algebra is so important in modern math. Most of us are introduced to algebra in high school, where we learn like pre-algebra and like other techniques and concepts that are shown here in this word bubble. Algebra is the most important branch of modern math. There are algebraic branches of different types of math, such as algebraic geometry, algebraic number theory, algebraic combinatorics, and algebraic topology.
Okay, so unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and so did the House of Wisdom. So the destruction and cultural relevance of the House of Wisdom. So the House of Wisdom was destroyed during the Mongol invasion in 1258. And Caliph al-Mustasim, who was the caliph during the time, was killed along with his family and most of the people in Baghdad. The books were thrown into the Tigris River, and there's a legend that states that it was stained black with ink and red with blood, which is also a scholarly exaggeration, but I'm sure that there might be some truth within this devastating image. So there was a lot of difficulty recovering some of the texts within the House of Wisdom after it was burned to the ground. But actually, one of the scholars, al-Tusi, actually saved 400,000 texts, even though most of the cultural history was lost. So finally, the House of Wisdom serves as a symbol of the Islamic golden age of science and of the vast advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and geography that are believed to be here. And its legacy within mathematics and within these fields are still with us through these 400,000 texts that were saved.
Okay, so that was the end of the second presentation, and so we move on. So again, if you have any questions, please write them in Q&A. We'll answer them at the end. Okay, so we now move on to the third presentation, which is a video, digital storytelling about one of the greatest Islamic scholars and his contributions. So please go ahead and start your presentation and introduce yourself first. Sophie and Maya and Jade.
Hi, my name is Sophie Lacombe. I'm a junior, and I'm majoring in modern languages and literatures with a focus in Russian.
Hello, my name is Maya Maharaj. I'm also a junior, and I'm an English major, Spanish minor, and I'm from Orange, California.
I'm Jade. I'm a junior as well. I'm an English major with a creative writing emphasis, and I'm from Dallas, Texas.
For centuries, Ibn al-Haytham's monumental scientific discoveries went largely unnoticed by history. Unfortunately, Western scientists like Copernicus and Galileo received the majority of credit while relying heavily on the works of Islamic scholars such as al-Haytham, whose work was published hundreds of years beforehand. Researchers are just now beginning to understand and report on the instrumental work of these Islamic scholars. While ancient Islamic scientist Ibn al-Haytham's name may not be as well known as that of Copernicus or Isaac Newton, we certainly benefit from his discoveries every day. From the invention of the camera obscura, which changed our understanding of vision as well as art and led to the creation of movies, to the development of the scientific method, Ibn al-Haytham had a massive influence on science over the course of his life, including revolutionary work in the science of vision. Before Ibn al-Haytham, scientists thought that either vision worked through light rays that came from the eye, known as the emission theory, or that forms entered the eyes from an object, known as the intromission theory. Ibn al-Haytham discovered that the truth lay somewhat in between the two of these theories. Vision is actually made possible by rays of light entering the eye and stimulating the optic nerve. He wrote the Book of Optics, which revolutionized science in that area. So, how did this scientist make such important discoveries? Well, Ibn al-Haytham was born in 965 AD in Basra, which is now Iraq. At the time, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was a thriving center of knowledge and study in Iraq. Ibn al-Haytham was well positioned to pursue a life of study and scholarship. It is a Muslim belief that seeking truth brings one closer to God, and this motivated many Islamic scholars, including al-Haytham, in their discoveries in fields such as mathematics, science, theology, astronomy, and more.
In his early life, Ibn al-Haytham was a devout scholar of Muslim texts. At first, his academic focus was theology, a subject he thought would be able to get him closest to the truth, and therefore closer to God. One of his motivations was to reconcile the differences between the Sunni and Shia sects. However, he was unable to find truth and eventually determined that the differences between the two were mostly based on the personal background of each group's members. Frustrated that this quest for truth had hit a dead end, determined to focus upon things that could be proved rationally, and inspired by the objective observation used by Aristotle, Ibn al-Haytham made his way to the House of Wisdom to study mathematics, science, physics, and logic. After studying the works of Aristotle, he read those of Euclid and eventually Ptolemy, whose Almagest he planned to make a thorough commentary on. However, just as he was beginning to become the scholar that he so wanted to be, Ibn al-Haytham was appointed to a government position in Basra. It is unclear what the position entailed, though some speculate that he was a civil engineer. Whatever position, Ibn al-Haytham would have had to accept it. Failing to do so would disrespect the government, not to mention forego financial and social security for himself and his family. However, the job also took time away from al-Haytham's work. Eventually, al-Haytham was removed from his post due to insanity. Some historians believe that he faked the madness to return to his studies, while others see it as a genuine struggle with illness. His return to his studies did not last for long, though, as in year 1010, al-Hakim, the Caliph of Egypt, known as the Mad Caliph, sent a servant to bring Ibn al-Haytham to build a dam on the Nile. Having no ability to refuse such a powerful man, Ibn al-Haytham traveled to Egypt to meet with the Caliph. Once in Egypt, Ibn al-Haytham created and presented his plan, but he was ultimately unable to carry it out, either due to the expenses or logistics. Angered by this, al-Hakim sentenced him to be imprisoned.
However, imprisonment was not the end of Ibn al-Haytham's studies. While imprisoned, he experimented with light and vision and eventually invented the camera obscura. Camera comes from the Latin word for room, while obscura means darken. Ibn al-Haytham's camera obscura was very close to this definition, as it was a darkened room with a hole that allows light to enter and project an upside-down mirror image of whatever was outside the room. With this device, al-Haytham was able to understand how light rays travel separately to form images. He was also able to deduce that our visual abilities are activated by the brain, as light enters our eyes to stimulate the processes that allow us to see. This invention was described in his Book of Optics, which was also written while he was imprisoned. Ibn al-Haytham's theory of light and vision was nothing like previous theories from Greek or Islamic scholars, and was the first theory of vision to place emphasis on the lens and its ability to produce a magnified image. His 7-volume treatise he wrote while being incarcerated, Kitab al-Manazir, or Book of Optics, goes into depth in discussing theories of light reflection, refraction, and dispersion, forming the basis for the invention of spectacles, microscopes, and telescopes. He also attempted to explain binocular vision. The development of this invention and the discoveries about optics that it led to was important not only in the field of physics, but also in all sciences. However, these discoveries were not the most important advancement Ibn al-Haytham made for science. It was his systematic approach to studying and testing hypotheses that revolutionized the field, providing instructions for experimenters to collect empirical evidence for their questions, rather than relying on human perception alone. His pioneering of the modern scientific method allowed science to flourish all over the world and allowed the experiments of the most well-known scientists after him to flourish. For that reason, figures like Galileo, Copernicus, Isaac Newton, and Johannes Kepler are all in Ibn al-Haytham's debt.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, Jade, and Maya. Okay, now, again, so if you have any questions, please write them in Q&A. We are going to attend them at the end. Okay, our next presentation is on another great Islamic scholar, al-Kindi, and his work in cryptography. So Spencer, Haley, and Adam. So would you please introduce yourself first? Oh, Sophie, did you stop?
Okay. My name is Adam Margolis. I'm a junior and I'm a history major.
My name is Haley Baluch. I am a junior English and history major, and I am logging on from New Jersey.
And last and certainly least, my name is Spencer Hirsch, and I am an English major with an emphasis in creative writing, and I am from suburban New York City.
Okay, so our project is on the secret of al-Kindi's cryptanalysis. And to preface al-Kindi's work, we're sort of going to explain the origins of cryptanalysis and cryptology. Cryptology, meaning coming from the Greek words kryptos, meaning hidden or secret, and logias, to study, deals with the encrypting of messages and that are only decipherable through the use of an accompanying key. Cryptology forms the basis of secure communication and was used throughout history and ancient history to hide messages so that third parties who might intercept hidden messages wouldn't be able to understand them. Cryptanalysis is the art of decoding those encrypted messages with or without the use of a key. And it too comes from the Greek words kryptos, hidden or secret, and analyne, to analyze. And the reason why that cryptanalysis can be done to decode a ciphered message, an enciphered message without a key, is because of the fact that its basis comes from statistics and mathematics, statistical inference, and frequency analysis. And it really is the systematic breakdown of hidden messages. And as you'll see next, it sort of forms the basis of the analysis of secret writing.
All right, so as Adam introduced for us, we're really going to be focusing on cryptography when we get to it. But in order to understand cryptography, you have to understand what it comes from. And so all of this is under the umbrella term communication security, which seems like, like a very common thing nowadays. When we have the internet, we have emails, we have data breaches and all these things all over the news, and this idea of trying to keep your information private. But that is not something new, and it is not something limited to the digital age by any means, as Adam was hinting, because throughout history, we have examples of secret writing, which is the broad term for any means by which a body tries to hide a meaning or an actual piece of writing from someone else to keep things private. So secret writing breaks down into two different branches, the first being steganography. Although we're not focusing on that in our project, it is quite interesting. So steganography is the hiding of messages rather than the hiding of meaning of messages, if that makes sense. So some, classical examples are described in classical texts, including shaving a servant's head, tattooing a message on his head, and then waiting for his hair to grow back, and then sending him to the intended recipient, shaving his head and showing the message, or using alum and vinegar to write on a hard-boiled egg, and it won't show up on the shell, but when you crack open the egg, it'll show up. So it's like the hiding of messages, but it has, its own inherent problems, because if someone finds the message on purpose or accidentally, the message is out there for not just the intended recipient, but whoever found the message, which brings us into the second branch of secret writing. This is cryptography, which is really what we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. So while steganography is hiding messages, cryptography doesn't necessarily mean hiding messages. It means hiding the meaning of the message within its own structure. So even if someone were to grab this message or to find it, they wouldn't necessarily know what it means. So cryptography breaks down into two other branches, just in the same way that secret writing branches into steganography and cryptography. The first being transposition. So transposition is a certain type of encipherment, which involves the placement of letters on, a page, on some sort of paper, leather, things like that. And it could be, physically on the page or within itself. So kind of like an anagram that we would use today. A classic example is actually a Spartan device, which was a certain log that they would wrap some sort of paper or leather or strip around, write the message, and then unravel it. And unless you had the log at the exact same diameter and wrapped it around, you wouldn't know what it means. Unlike that, we have substitutions. So substitution systems are a means by which you take one alphabet and replace it with something else. So a classic example is Julius Caesar. It's actually named after him now. It's called a shift cipher, the Julius Caesar shift cipher, or the Caesar cipher, which is just when he wrote his messages, what he would do is he would take the letters of the text that he was using and then shift them down by 3. So, instead of doing A, it might be, it would be D, things like that. And then depending on, how he set it up, it could also go backwards. So A being X that way. So substitution ciphers break down again into two different things. So we have codes, which you can see in the top right. That's replacing words, like whole words, with either numbers, symbols, or other words. Sometimes it can be whole sentences replaced by a word, but there's so many different ways to do that. That it becomes hard for the intended recipient to keep track of how it's gonna, wind up being, encrypted and then to de-encrypt it later. A classic example of codes are, used in the military. So although they can be, quite strong, sometimes it gets to the point where there is no systematic way to break it down unless a whole body has memorized it all. Which brings us to ciphers. So ciphers are a little bit different. Instead of taking whole chunks, we're taking letters themselves or chunks of words themselves and replacing them with numbers, symbols, other letters from a different alphabet, things like that. So you can see in the top right. So that's going to be something that we're focusing on because al-Kindi, which Spencer will get to in a minute, was focusing on Greek and Roman sources of ciphers, where they would replace the alphabet with another. And it's actually quite interesting because our word for cipher actually comes from Arabic for zero. And it's what we're going to be focusing on in our presentation because it was the basis for cryptography and ciphers before they started getting more complicated and what we might see in like more commonly known things like World War II with the Enigma and things like that. So for like a quick background before we get into al-Kindi and understanding how his system works, for a substitution cipher, you have what's called plain text. So that's the written message that someone is trying to send. And so that is in its source language. Then in order to get it to be encrypted, which is just a broad term for either codes or ciphers, but if you want to talk specifically about ciphers, you would say enciphered, it has to go through an algorithm. And then it will come out on the other side as ciphertext. The only way to understand the algorithm is through a key, which hopefully only the writer and the intended recipient know. Which brings us to Spencer.
All right, so let's talk about al-Kindi. Al-Kindi was one of the greatest medieval scholars. He was a true polymath who did work in a lot of different fields. He was most famous actually for his work in the field of philosophy. He was known as the philosopher of the Arabs. And he also prevailed in medicine, music theory, and of course, mathematics, which is what we'll talk about today. More specifically, cryptography and cryptanalysis. So the foundations required to develop the sciences of cryptography and cryptanalysis are translations, theology, and linguistics. In the Abbasid Caliphate, during the golden age of Islamic science, there was a massive translation movement made by bureaucrats and administrators alike to take works from antiquity, from Syriac society, from ancient Hindu society, and translate them into Arabic and even edit them and improve on them so the knowledge base in the Abbasid Caliphate could grow and expand. As that expanded, so did the Arabic language and its linguistic features. The language advanced rapidly with the translation movement and with the administrative needs of the Abbasid Caliphate. And finally, theology in Islamic society demands that all followers of Allah pursue knowledge to the best of their ability, all worldly knowledge. And these are the foundations required to develop this statistical science. So al-Kindi was born in 801 in the city of Kufa in modern-day Iraq. It was considered a cultural Islamic hub. He's actually an ethnic Arabian from the southern Arabian Peninsula from the Kinda tribe. In Kufa, he received the first-rate education because his father was governor of Kufa, as was his grandfather. But he was not destined for the same occupation. He was summoned to Baghdad by the Caliph al-Mamun to work at the House of Wisdom with the father of algebra, al-Khwarizmi, and the Banu Musa brothers. In 841, al-Kindi published his treatise, A Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages. This is the oldest known book published on the subject, and al-Kindi's research on this subject would continue under 4 Abbasid caliphs until he died aged 72 in 873.
So as Spencer introduced for us, al-Kindi was, a polymath. And so if you look into his background and his contribution to the sciences, it goes beyond anything that we're just talking about here. But what's really exciting is his manuscript on deciphering cryptographic messages actually lays the foundation for frequency analysis, which is, statistical inference, which is something that, will lend into modern day statistical computing. So in just the first in the first 2 paragraphs of his manuscript, he describes what we might know using like the multinomial distribution and things like that we could run on computers to analyze, comparisons of like relative frequencies. So if we look like about halfway down, he pretty much describes, then we look at the ciphertext we want to solve and we classify its symbols, and we find the most occurring symbol and change it to the form of the first letter of the plain text sample. So pretty much he's just describing figuring out the frequency in the source language and figuring out the frequency in the ciphertext, and then trying to match them up based off of their relative frequencies, which is, really interesting and exciting. So in order to illustrate Al-Kindi's methods, although we have modern day computing, we're gonna go through what he would have done, obviously with the help of computers too. But what we did was we took a sample text, which we'll reveal at the end, and we ran it through a monoalphabetical substitution algorithm, which just means that we're replacing the plain text with one ciphertext, which is just replacing one message with one alphabet. And in our example, we're using English, but it would have been done in Arabic. And so this is our ciphertext to start. So in order to, analyze and figure out what's going to happen, we have to take the frequency of all the letters of the English language in order to compare it to the relative frequencies we find in our ciphertext. There are some issues with this one. We have the ability to, run like software to figure this out based off of the hundreds, if not millions of texts, right? But for Al-Kindi, this would have had to been done by hand, counting letters, making assumptions, things like that. Not only that, but he also mentions, and later scholars mention, that you have to account for what kind of message it's going to be. If it's, it was a spoken message rather than a written message originally, certain letters might show up more often. Just for fun, when we were like looking this through, frequencies like change, obviously, depending on how short or long your message is too. So if it's super short, we know from the law of large numbers, which just means the more we have, the more likely it is going to be at its true frequency. So that's why we chose like a relatively big chunk. But this is the stats that we're going to be using for the English language. And then what we did was we graphed all of the letters, the relative frequencies of the letters of the ciphertext, so we can compare. Then what we did, which is something that Al-Kindi didn't necessarily describe in the same terms we're going to be using now, but definitely informed his work. We, on the left, found the relative frequencies of bigrams, which are just groups of 2 letters. And then on the right, found the relative frequencies of trigrams, which are groups of 3 letters. And as Spencer, emphasized before, it's not just matching, the highest frequency to highest frequency. You also have to have a firm foundation in the source language and understanding like linguistics and grammar and morphology to figure out what words are going to fill in where as well. So that's why we did the bigrams and trigrams. So for our first substitution, it was pretty easy just because in the English language, the letter E is very distinctive. But O shows up the most in our ciphertext, which we would then match with E, the most common occurring letter in the English language. But before we, immediately made that assumption, we also wanted to double check. So we looked at the most common bigram and the most common trigram, respectively being TS and TSO. And if we assume that E is going to be O, then we can look at the most common bigrams and trigrams in the English language, which unsurprisingly are TH and THE. So that, supports our substitution there. So we substitute E for O and TS for TH, which gives us this. There are many different ways that we can move from here. If you guys are looking, you might even be able to see some words that you think might fill in. It's not very different from filling out a cryptogram in like a puzzle book today. But following Al-Kindi's methods, we wanted to go back to the most occurring letters, bigrams, and trigrams. So for our second substitution, what we wanted to look at was the letter W in the ciphertext. So again, knowledge of the source language is important. In the English language, there are only 2 one-letter words, one being A and one being I. And if you look through our original ciphertext, a W shows up on its own. So we know that it's either going to be A or I. But to support our decision, we looked at the frequency of A in the English language, which matched up pretty nicely with the frequency of W. And we also looked at the second most common trigram, which was WEJ. And then we compared to the most common trigrams in the English language. There are no common trigrams in the English language that start with I, but and is in the top 10. So we substituted W for A and EJ for ND based off of that, and we got this. If you couldn't see any words before, If you were to, take a screenshot or like pause or anything like that, you might be able to start finding words here. And that's where it gets like really subjective. But as we move forward, we decided to go with the frequency analysis based off of Al-Kindi's work, even though we know that there were many letters that we could fill in just by understanding like morphology and how the English language works and like common words that show up. So for our last substitution, we looked at the next most common bigram that we had yet to touch. As we had already substituted TS, SO, and some of ET, what we decided to look at was VD. And VD does follow TH in very many instances in the ciphertext. So we wanted to look at common bigrams that would make sense after TH and also match up letter frequencies. So V matched up really nicely with I, and D matched up really nicely with S as well. And it would make sense after TH for it to be IS, so this. So this is our final substitution. After that, we really just filled in as we saw necessary. I mean, there were many different digraphs, which is just two letters that make the same sound, and you go from there. So after finishing all our substitutions, we got back to our plain text from our ciphertext, which was actually just a description of the course that we're in right now, so the history of math in the Islamic world. And so that's like a good example of how variable Al-Kindi's methods were, but also how instrumental they are. And not only that, it goes back to the fact that you have to have a firm foundation in mathematics and also like morphology, grammar, syntax, and language and linguistics for not just the source language, but also the language you're translating to.
So in conclusion, all of this shows that Al-Kindi's work on cryptanalysis is an extremely important part of deciphering encrypted messages. And this is sort of an interesting problem because in the classical narrative, Al-Kindi's work isn't really mentioned. And in the Western idea of cryptanalysis and cryptography in popular movies like the National Treasure series or The Imitation Game, cryptography and cryptanalysis are central focus points of these movies. First of all, the mathematical basis isn't really talked about, a little bit in The Imitation Game, but not at all in movies like The National Treasure, and nor is the Islamic Al-Kindi's influence on cryptanalysis discussed at all. So part of what we were trying to do with our project on Al-Kindi's cryptanalysis is argue for the inclusion of Al-Kindi within the framework of the alternative narrative, and to include the understanding that cryptology and cryptanalysis, especially cryptanalysis, has a basis in mathematics, and in combination, this will show that it's not an isolated Western phenomenon. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's our presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Haley, Spencer, and Adam. Okay, now we are about to have the last final presentation, which is a video on geometric patterns in Islamic art.
Hello, I'm Melody Wagner. I'm a sophomore and an English major with an emphasis in creative writing.
I'm Elizabeth Murata. I am a freshman that's undecided.
Hi, I am Lorraine Kaufman, and I am a first year and prospective English major. Can everyone see my screen? Is that all up and running?
Yep, you're good, Lorian.
Cool. All right.
The construction of beauty, geometric patterns in Islamic art. There are three types of decorative constructions in Islamic art: calligraphy, vegetal patterns, and geometric patterns. There is a geometric pattern that we will be discussing titled the Giri. Geometric patterns took off after al-Khwarizmi completed his first writings on geometry in the 9th century, along with his findings in algebra. Islamic artists refined these patterns into more complex designs, resulting in the Giri tile, which was a popular addendum to Islamic architecture that was developed around 1200 CE. In Islam, it is forbidden to idol worship except the worship of Allah. Mosques were constructed with this in mind, using geometric patterns as decoration rather than characters or persons which adorn most religious buildings. To add to this, Islamic scientists drew from Roman, Greek, and Sasanian influence as they had constructed patterns before, and Islamic artists took key elements from their art to mold it into two values important to Islamic society: unity and order. The incorporation of geometry grew with the expansion of Islamic math and science. Islamic art developed its own distinct style during the rise of sciences and maths, which is also when Giris were more fully developed and became popular. Giri translates to knot in Persian. From this came Giri tiles, which are 5 tiles of Giri combined edge to form a cohesive pattern. It is by far the most identifiable pattern in Islamic art and is seen in nearly every piece from the medieval times, from mosques and other architecture to more mundane things such as bowls and cupolas.
Though there are many types of Giri designs, Giri are generally based on repeating star-shaped patterns, surrounded by geometric figures. One of the simplest designs for a Giri consists of 2 squares, one set at a 45-degree angle to the other, to create an 8-pointed star. By continuing the 2 grids on which these squares lie, the pattern can continue on endlessly. Craftsmen designed Giri patterns using Euclidean tools, a straight edge and compass. With these tools, they could connect 2 points with straight lines, extend line segments, make curves with set radii around a certain point, bisect angles, and construct basic regular polygons, as well as other geometric functions. Originally, Islamic mathematicians would use tools in the direct strapwork method by constructing a geometric pattern within a unit cell, which they then repeated to create a periodic pattern. However, the unit cell method was restrictive in that it only allowed for 2-fold, 3-fold, 4-fold, and 6-fold rotational symmetries, meaning the number of times a figure repeats itself within a 360-degree rotation. In 12,000 CE, the creation of 5 decorated Giri tiles for constructing geometric line patterns opened up new possibilities. Here is one example of a Giri construction from the shrine of Khwaja Abdullah Ansari at Gazarga in Herat, Afghanistan. This pattern can be constructed using the 2 methods, direct strapwork within a rectangular unit cell, or using Giri tiles. First, a circle is inscribed and divided evenly by 10. Then, every 3rd point on the circle is connected by a line segment to create a decagonal star. The points of this star are used to create 2 semicircles. The unit rectangle should have the same height as these semicircles and a width equal to the diameter of the central circle. The craftsman would then eliminate the central decagon and extend the line segments while maintaining the 2-fold rotational symmetry of the unit cell. This completed cell can be repeated indefinitely. However, the overall pattern can also be broken down and constructed using 3 distinct Giri tiles. Here, a decagon with a decagonal star, a hexagon with a bat-like design, and a bow-tie shape with 2 quadrilaterals. The decorating lines meet at the midpoint of each side of the polygons at angles that are multiples of 36 degrees, so that the lines meet at the borders between tiles without changing direction. With a complete set of 5 Giri tiles, the possibilities of construction are endless, and reach far beyond the restrictions of direct construction using a unit cell.
Detailed patterns such as the giras are incredibly important to the Islamic community and culture. Art is the mirror of a culture and its worldview, and the detailed artistic patterns used by the medieval Islamic artists show the prevalence of their faith and its key values. The use of mathematics to make the art was novel and is still not commonly used today. Islamic art is representative of spiritual objects, and instead of replicating something, Muslim artists work to convey what their muses are representing, whether it be the infiniteness of Allah, the beautiful symmetry of nature, or the complexity of the universe and intricate patterns. An example of this would be the use of geometry. It is thought to reflect the language of the universe and help the believer to reflect on life and the greatness of creation. Some aspects, as seen in the Gira, are the complex repetitive patterns which appear unending, similar to how Allah is infinite, and the smallness of these patterns show how even in the small you can find the infinite.
Into everyday Islamic life, decorating mosques, but also covering more mundane objects such as bowls, cups, and vases. Many important items, such as the Persian rugs, are used in Western culture with little thoughts about the origins of this art. Persian rugs utilize the geometric patterns to make shapes. This is an example of how the use of geometric patterns were integrated into everyday art.
In conclusion, Islamic art is a major part of the overall culture and shows how core beliefs such as an infinite God, a love for symmetry, and representing the spirituality of something are all predominant in the Islamic culture and faith.
Thank you for watching our presentation on the history, construction, and cultural significance of the Giri.
Okay, thank you. So this was the end of our presentations. So thank you all of the students who presented their work, their hard work for the whole semester. So how should we go about questions and answers? So I see like a few
Thank you.
questions in Q&A.
Yes. So thank you to all. I want to say a thank you to Dr. Aydin for joining us via Zoom and YouTube. And thank you to all of the students also for presenting your work online. I know that you know, that brings its own challenges and awkwardness sometimes, and you don't see your audience in front of you, so you don't see how you know, all the feedback and how excited everybody is to receive this information, but it was all really wonderful. So we thank you for that. We do have a few questions that I will present to Dr. Aydin, and if you would like to redirect them to any of the students, then you know, you know where to direct those questions to. So our first question was, can you please speak about the circular building at the House of Wisdom?
This is obviously to the group who presented on House of Wisdom.
So I'm not 100% sure what exactly this question is about, because we had a picture of a circular building, but there's two. I'm going to answer both what I think it could be. So on the presentation, we had a picture of a circular building, and that was in a scholar's like rendition of what they thought the House of Wisdom may have looked like, because no one really knows. You know, there weren't pictures and there haven't been any drawings that have fully survived outside of maybe small individual features of it. So we know what it contained and we know some of the specific buildings, but that may have just been artist's rendition. If it was more to like a specific room we mentioned, there was a circular corridor in the middle, which was roofed, but was used for lectures, which we mentioned.
Thank you so much. Next question is, what triggered Muslim scholars to study the nature during the golden age of Islam, and what do you think happened to the culture next after 8th century?
So this is perhaps most related to the first presentation, at least the first part of it.
Well, I think what happened is with the translation and scientific stuff, originally there was actually began for politics, you see. Basically the Persians were basically getting replaced with the Arabic people, so to like one up them, they decided to translate Greek works, and then when the other group found out, they would decide to discover, so it was more discovery for the sake of political advancement. And it actually continued to at least the 15th century, the scientific discovery. So yeah, there was still scientific discovery way after the 8th century, and in fact, there may have been even after the 1500s, but no one really ever bothered to look through that.
I'd say even in modernity, Muslim scholars are still prominent and making discoveries.
So I may add maybe a few things to this answer. So in terms of studying nature, if you look at the Quran, there are many verses in the Quran that urge human beings to contemplate on nature. Study so many different phenomena in nature. From the creation of the earth and the heaven, and the alternation of the night and the day, to the creation of the mountains, to all kinds of things in the nature. So there is a very strong encouragement in terms of theological and philosophical at the philosophical and theological level. But again, as we already mentioned, to practice certain things in Islam, you have to look at the nature. You have to look at the movement of the sun and the moon, for example, to determine the time for everything from prayer times to the beginning and end of Ramadan. So there was really a strong foundation and encouragement and even requirement from the Islamic faith to study nature. So the second part of the question, what happened to the culture after 8th century? Well, 8th century, things were barely beginning, right? So 8th century was really the beginning of all the scientific activities, which continued into the 15th century for sure, right? So the book I am translating is from the 15th century, which is later in the Islamic civilization. So so Islamic science was well and live and really at the very high level even into the 15th century. So after that, so after the 15th century, what happened is that Europe progressed much faster, and Islamic world fell behind as a combination of a number of internal and external factors, which I'm not going to go into and we didn't talk about in these presentations. But I really urge the Muslim community to think about what happened, what happened after the Golden Age, why did it end? What was the reason behind it? These are really great questions for the Muslim community to think about. And I also want to caution, again, especially the Muslim community, there are some simplistic answers to these questions offered. I would like to caution every one of us to accept these simplistic answers, so easily. I mean, and again, there needs to be more research on this question as well. And it is one of the great open questions to which we need to pay more attention to.
Thank you for your perspective as well, Dr. Aydin. I'd like to take one of the questions from another channel that we have. The question is, how did learning history about the how did learning the history of the House of Wisdom change your perception of Islamic history?
This is specific to that group, looks like.
So how did learning about the House of Wisdom change our perception of Islamic history? I mean, throughout the course I've taken with Professor Aydin, my perception of Islamic history has grown a great deal, but learning particularly about the House of Wisdom, I was particularly struck by what I was kind of learning about the Islamic community in that sense, and what I was learning about, because the House of Wisdom is fundamentally a very communal building, where scholars would basically meet together. So I felt like I felt like the House of Wisdom, through its text, it had a lot of particular emphasis on Islamic culture in terms of the more intellectual side of Islamic culture. So I kind of became more connected, and I felt more connected to the scholars that we had briefly touched base on as I was, well, my group and I, we were studying them more in depth. So if that answers the question, I mean, my other group members can jump in
Or
if they
even the
want
whole
to.
class, right? I mean, anyone in the class can, if you have anything to share, please go ahead and do so.
I just wanted to jump in specifically for the House of Wisdom too. I think it definitely deepened my knowledge because, and it deepened my appreciation for how much of the Islamic like scientific cultural tradition has been ignored, because this was such a massive library and it was so influential. I mean, it had millions of books and there were so many famous scholars and so many famous people, like Amanda mentioned in her part of the presentation. Charlemagne would trade books and academic sources with the House of Wisdom and the Caliphs who ruled over it. And I just think that it just goes to show how little is known about this tradition when something so massive and so important is rarely known.
Thank you so much. I just want to say, I'm not answering the question, but I want to comment. And I know just from what Dr. Aydin has said in the past that this seems to be his experience as well. Unfortunately, because of the way that the history has been written and rewritten in the West, even many Muslims who grow up in the West, and I would say even Muslims who grow up in predominantly Muslim countries, unfortunately don't know this history or don't know the depth of this history. And this is not something that I had known actually until a few years ago. I had come across this and we had really dove into this information and made it a point to share this with the kids in our community in several different ways. And so this is one of the reasons that we're so excited to host Dr. Aydin every year and his students. So we're really pleased to hear also that it has had a positive effect on many of you. I'll take another question. So the question is, where are the 400,000 saved texts now?
Okay, I think anybody wants to answer this one? This is again related to the House of Wisdom.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that there's not a ton of information surrounding where they went or what happened with them. It was known that Al-Tusi saved them, but there's not a ton more. However, we know that a lot of these manuscripts and original works are still saved today in libraries all over the world, but there's not too much known about what happened right at the first time, and they've kind of all spread out at this point.
Actually, I can add a bit more to this. Actually, it was Tusi, famous, he's one of the famous and best known Islamic scholars whose work influenced Copernicus. They actually saved them specifically because he already convinced the Mongol ruler, Ilkhanil Khan, who invaded Baghdad. He convinced him to establish an observatory in Iran called Maraga Observatory, which was the most advanced observatory at the time. So Tusi probably shipped them to that another scientific institution, Maraga Observatory, which was established just a year after Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1259.
Thank you, Dr. Aydin. There's a question here. I think this is regarding the presentation that was focused on art. It's asking if you can please spell the name of the Giri tiles.
Oh, spell, yeah, you can.
I'm not sure if I'm picking up on the right pronunciation.
Yeah, it's GIRIH, and honestly, I might be saying it a bit wrong as well. I'd be happy to hear if there's someone who has more knowledge on that. But yeah, yeah.
Thanks so much. We have another question that says, thank you to all the presenters. As Professor Aydin said at the beginning of the evening, it's important that this knowledge be shared in schools. Are any of the students in the class considering pursuing a career in teaching?
Let's see, anyone considering this? I know that some of you are undecided. Oh, but there are a few of you, several of you. Okay. All right.
Good to know. So some of this knowledge may be passed on.
But I would like to add, though, in addition to the efforts of individual teachers, I think there needs to be an effort at the larger level. At the, this event, ultimately, this is a political thing, right? What to include in school curriculum and what not to include is sort of like it has a political aspect as well. Though I have seen from my own kids, that even if it is in the curriculum, the teacher may actually skip that material. I have seen it with my own kids, and I advise you to. So definitely, having teachers who are knowledgeable on this subject definitely helps.
For sure. Thank you, Dr. Aydin. On that note, I will also take the opportunity to say that I would heavily encourage everyone to get involved in their kids' middle schools and high schools curriculum development as much as possible. When these opportunities arise, I know that sometimes schools will ask, and the principal of my kids' schools knows me by first name basis as much as I call and talk about these different kinds of things. And it's always better to communicate about these kinds of things. So another question, thank you for all the amazing work. In the cryptography presentation, you guys mentioned the depiction of cryptography in movies and how it lacks reference to the role of Muslim scientists in them. Do you think that more references to the alternative narrative are more crucial in pop culture or in academic communities? In other words, where do you suggest that the first step should be taken?
I guess I'll answer this one. I would advocate for, I think, a sort of combined approach, if that makes any sense. I think that a large understanding of certain difficult or complicated mathematical or scientific concepts can be distilled really well in a lot of like pop culture, like movies or books. So I think that as a basis, that sort of alternative narrative needs to be emphasized in pop culture as like a starting point. But I also think that just like your discussion about, curriculum in middle schools and high school, I think that it really does need to be sort of an academic and institutional change in instruction, because otherwise, people are going to, understand that it does have a basis in, this medieval Islamic world, but, their understanding of it might be skewed or the perception of it might be, tainted by whatever perspective the person who wrote the movie or wrote the book is presenting. And I think that's why an academic lens might be, I think, overall the way to go, even though the cultural part, pop culture, is important.
I would definitely agree with that. I do believe that unless this material is commonly taught in schools, I truly believe that there will be lack of awareness on this. So as long as we continue to teach this Eurocentric history of science, which excludes Islamic civilization, I don't think there will be a large scale change in the society.
Thank you. We are running well over time, so I'm going to wrap up with the last question here. What do you think about the relationship between the leadership and the scientific studies in all cultures all times overall in comparison with the Golden Age of Islam?
That's quite the question to end on. Historically speaking, during the Golden Age of Islam, the relationship between leadership and scientific bodies was much more amicable than you're likely to find in other societies. Obviously, in modern times, most developed countries have their own scientific departments, but for most of history, it's generally accepted that leaders of political and religious bodies were not very accepting of scientific research. Like Copernicus is a good example of that, or Galileo, their work against the Catholic Church.
Okay, Sophie, do you want to?
Yeah, my project wasn't on this particular topic, but I found myself comparing a lot of these ideas to what we saw with our last presidential administration and his relationship with science. And I think that it is really interesting that that Islam during its golden age went large, like as in, now we are starting to learn more about what they actually achieved during this time. But for a long, in my elementary and middle school and high school education, I never learned about any of this. And I've noticed that a lot of my classmates, the story is the same. So it's really interesting to think about like the sort of country we've grown up in and the president that we've had in the past, his sort of complete lack of faith and faith in science or support of science was a really interesting aspect of it. And it made me appreciate the golden age of Islam even more, to know that the government was so invested in this, in its society, sort of increasing its knowledge base as much as possible. I think that that is incredibly admirable and should be celebrated more than it is.
Okay. Laureen, did you want to say something as well?
Yeah, going off of what Sophie said, I think the things that I found most incredible when learning about the Golden Age of Islam was both the governmental support for scientific research, religious support and encouragement of scientific research and the pursuit of knowledge and truth, and also just the general spirit of collaboration in places like the House of Wisdom, sort of this not claiming discoveries for oneself, or sort of an awareness that scientific and mathematical work and discoveries would continue on after the life of one scholar, or even the life of a succession of scholars. I thought that was really incredible, and probably led to the creation of such a just a flourishing time in science.
So we're going to wrap up now. Dr. Aydin, do you have any closing remarks before I wrap up the webinar?
I think I spoke enough, and I made my remarks at the beginning. I hope so this program will be useful in spreading this information and increasing awareness. And I hope the recording will be available to others who couldn't watch it at the time. And I hope we'll continue with our efforts in the future as well. And our collaboration with Noor Islamic Center will continue.
Thank you, Dr. Aydin, for being with us, for joining our online community. Thank you to all of the students as well. As you may be able to see in the chat, there's tons of great comments just about how much they appreciate this work. you bringing to light all of this different information. We greatly appreciate the collaboration, Dr. Aydin, every year. And we appreciate the opportunity this year to live stream the event. It will be on YouTube after this. So feel free, any of you, to share this with friends and family. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Good night.